Well, good morning. It's good to see you all this morning. I'm Steve. If we haven't met, I'm married to Tammy, who you have met. And if you were around last Sunday, you will know we started a new teaching series. And this series is called Rhythm of Renewal. And in this season, we're exploring a number of different kind of spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, if you like. And in doing so, we're attempting to define really what it means for us as a church to have a kind of shared rule of life. What's a rule of life, you ask? Thanks for asking. Well, a rule of life is something that Christians have followed and adopted for centuries. And in the Christian tradition, a rule of life is not a list of legalistic rules like some tick box exercise where somehow you prove yourself to God. Instead, a rule of life is about creating a rhythm or a framework that helps us to follow Jesus in every area of our lives. And so these practices that we're exploring kind of keep us rooted in our faith. The word rule comes from the Latin regula, which means trellis. And for those of you who are horticultural in the room, you will know what a trellis does. It's a wooden frame that helps a plant or a vine grow. The trellis doesn't give life itself, but rather it gives a structure that helps to create the right conditions for plants to grow upwards and bear fruit. And so in the same way, a rule of life is like a spiritual trellis, if you like. It gives our lives the structure and support we need to grow in Christ and actually it causes us to produce fruit. Fruit, Jesus says, that will remain. And so to help us do this, we put together this little booklet called Rhythm of Renewal. We were going to get them printed, but it's then going to cost a small fortune. And so your only option is the PDF. So do feel free to download that if you can. But in this booklet, we've outlined several different practices, and each week we're going to unpack one together. And to help us remember them, to kind of put these practices in our muscle memory, if you like, we've chosen to use this acronym of renewal. And so renewal, it stands for these 7 different practices that we are exploring. So R is read, which is all about us being people who immerse ourselves in the scriptures and letting God's word be the anchor for our lives. E is for eat, which is about sharing meals, opening up our homes in hospitality. N is for neighbor, learning to live as men and women who are sent to our neighborhoods and loving those around us. E is for empower, that we're called to be a blessing to others with our words and actions and to give strength to others. W is for worship, that we're called to have lives of devotion and generosity, giving ourselves fully to God. A is abide, which is all about us finding Sabbath and rest in a world that is restless. And L is listen. And it's all about the practices of prayer and silence and solitude in order that we create enough space, enough margin in our lives to hear God's voice. And in adopting these practices, it's our hope it would enable us to do 3 simple things. It would enable us to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do the very things that Jesus did. That would be the guiding principles that we have. And so as we lean into our next practice, let me start by asking us a couple of questions. They're rhetorical questions, don't worry, you haven't got to shout them out. But let me ask you a couple of questions. What is one of the most ordinary things every human being does? Almost certainly every day of our lives. In fact, in the average lifetime, you will do this 87,000 times. Eat. It wasn't a trick question. But be that breakfast, lunch, snacks in between, dinner, all of us have a need to eat. Some of you are eating right now. All of us have a need to eat. So here's another question. What was one of the things that Jesus did a lot of in his ministry? He ate. He ate with people. He didn't just preach sermons from hillsides. He didn't just perform miracles, but he shared meals in homes, around tables with friends and with strangers, and sometimes even with people that made other people feel very uncomfortable. In Luke's gospel alone, there are at least 50 references to Jesus and food. I like this Jesus. Let's just highlight a few. Luke chapter 2, Jesus is born in a feeding trough as a way to say he is food for the world. In Luke chapter 5, he eats with tax collectors and sinners in Levi's house. In Luke chapter 7, he's anointed in the home of Simon the Pharisee during a meal. In Luke chapter 9, he feeds the 5,000. In Luke chapter 10, he eats at the home of Mary and Martha. In Luke chapter 11, he highlights the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his day, at a meal. Jesus is at a meal when he calls his disciples, he says to them, next time you throw a party, swing open the doors to the poor. In chapter 15, in the story of the prodigal son, it ends with a meal or a party. Chapter 16 of Luke, Jesus tells a story about a rich man who ate like a king and a poor man, Lazarus, who begged for the scraps from the man's table. That story didn't end too well for the rich man. In Luke chapter 19, we read Jesus invites himself over to dinner at Zacchaeus' house. In chapter 22, we see the Last Supper, which was at Passover. In Luke chapter 24, right after the resurrection, the first thing Jesus does is he breaks bread with a married couple, two of his disciples. And then he goes to the rest of his disciples, and the first thing he says to them is, do you have any fish? It seems that when you've got a resurrected body, it gives you an appetite. The New Testament scholar Robert Kerris writes, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. Tim Chester, in his book, A Meal with Jesus, which is one of the recommended readings that we've given you, he picks up on this line in Luke's gospel that says, the Son of Man came, which is only used twice in Luke's gospel. On one occasion, it's describing Jesus' mission. On another, it's describing his methodology. And so in Luke 19:10, it says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. This was Jesus' mission. This was what he came to do. But in Luke 7 and verse 34, it says, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. This was Jesus' methodology. This was how he did it. Hospitality, which is the practice that we're leaning into today, was one of Jesus's main strategies for his mission. He didn't build a program. He didn't hand out leaflets. He didn't have a slick social media campaign. He simply opened his life to other people, often over a meal. As I say, I like this Jesus. And so today I want to suggest that this simple practice of hospitality is one of the most powerful ways that we can live out the gospel in our everyday lives. So let's take a look at one of those moments. If you've got a Bible, we're going to be in Luke 19. Really need to get better at kind of like how we logistically do this. And I've got to put the glasses on. So Luke 19, we're just going to look at the first 10 verses. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Jesus reached the spot. He looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now, it's easy, isn't it, when we hear a passage like this, particularly if you grew up in church like me, you kind of read this story in a kind of cute, sentimental Sunday flannel graph kind of way. And if you don't know what flannel graph is, don't worry, you don't need to know. And we kind of see this as almost like, oh, it's like some moral tale that Jesus is nice to short people as well. You know, that's how we can read this. But to the original hearers of this, it wasn't cute, it wasn't funny, it wasn't sweet. It's actually dangerous. It was disruptive. Because Jesus is disrupting the status quo. He's doing something very controversial in this moment in 2 very distinct ways. First of all, Zacchaeus is a tax collector, which in the society he was in was the worst of the worst. Israel were occupied and oppressed by the Roman Empire, and tax collectors were Jews, not Romans, who had sold out their fellow countrymen. And so they were notoriously corrupt because they made a living by adding their own fee onto the Roman tax. And so if you imagine you are Simon the fisherman, and you come and you bring your, what you've caught for the day, and you've got to pay tax on that. It might be that the Roman Empire say you've got to pay 50% tax on that. And when you get to the tax collector's booth, he's then going to slap on his fee, and he's going to say, and maybe he'll say like 70%. So suddenly you've lost 70% of your income. And if you upset that tax collector, he might say, well, today I'm going to charge you 80. And so you can imagine how tax collectors were hated. And so culturally, 2 of the lowest run on the moral ladder in this time were tax collectors and prostitutes. And who does Jesus eat with on a regular basis? Just a cursory look at the scriptures. Who does Jesus eat with on a basis? Not a trick question, just giving you the answer. Tax collectors and prostitutes. Now, again, we can read this, can't we? And we can think, Jesus, you're so rad. Jesus, you're just a complete rock star. You're like this radical anti-fundamentalist. And we can read it in that way because we don't have tax collectors. And we're not under Roman oppression. And so to understand the impact of what Jesus is doing here, we have to transpose a tax collector to whoever we see at the bottom of the moral ladder in our society. And then we have to ask ourselves, what if we saw Jesus eating with them? How would we feel if Jesus came on the scene today and we heard a story that Jesus was eating dinner with a child abuser? Or what if you heard he went over to lunch with someone who was like a white nationalist or some sort of extreme racist? Or what if you saw a video of Jesus eating dinner around a campfire in a cave with a ISIS terrorist in the mountains of Pakistan or Afghanistan? How would that make you feel? Scared? Offended? Angry? Confused? That's exactly how people felt when Jesus walked into Zacchaeus' home. Secondly, meals meant more in this culture than they do ours. You know, in every culture, meals are what anthropologists call boundary markers. They bring people together or they keep people apart. And think about it, most of us eat with people who are like us, who fall into the same sort of socio-economic background. A lot of us eat with people that are of the same ethnicity as us. This is true of all societies, but it was especially true in the first century Jewish culture at that time. And because of Jewish purity laws, no Gentile, which means no Jewish person, would ever be allowed in your home, let alone sit round your table. Neither would anyone with any special needs or a person who was deformed in any way. They were considered defiled. And especially someone who was called a sinner. They wouldn't be welcome at your table. And all of that's to say is that a rabbi, which Jesus was identified as, in this culture would never be caught dead in the home of someone like Zacchaeus. But let's notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, hey, Zacchaeus, clean up your life and then let's talk. He doesn't say, meet me at the synagogue where everything is neat and respectable. He says, hey, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house. Put on the kettle. I'm coming round today. And it's over a meal. It's sitting round a table that Zacchaeus has this life-changing encounter with Jesus. And he stands up and he says, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody, I will pay them back 4 times the amount. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to this home. How did that happen? What did Jesus say? What happened through this meal? Through this act of hospitality? In many ways, for lack of a better word, I would say this is Jesus's method of evangelism. And I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with that E word, evangelism. It's not in the Bible. And, it comes with sort of a set of connotations, doesn't it, evangelism? But I can't think of a better word. I think it was Jesus's method of evangelism. But it wasn't in this, I guess the thing that I'm struggling with is it wasn't this kind of bait and switch type thing. We've all met those Christians, haven't they? And they're like, I'm gonna entice you with this, but this is what I really want to give you. You know, it's a bit like a multi-level marketeer, you know. I'm gonna give you some really nice champagne, but you're gonna buy this timeshare. You know, that wasn't what Jesus was doing. I think a meal with Jesus might look like him asking questions and then him listening, really listening. And that he was willing to meet people right where they're at, not where they should be. And he was willing to do that and love them at the same time. So let's pause and ask, what do we mean by hospitality? Greek word for hospitality is phenoxena, and it's a compound word. Philo means love, and xenos means stranger or foreigner or immigrant or refugee or outsider or just a guest. Don't tell anyone in reform. Okay. So think about it. Xenophobia is the opposite to hospitality, because xenophobia is the fear or the phobia of a stranger, the outsider, the immigrant. Hospitality actually means the love of a stranger. The love of a stranger. You could actually define hospitality as this. John Mark Comer says this, so it must be true. You could say hospitality is an expression expressing the welcome of God to all through the tangible act of love. Ideally, that comes through food, shelter, and relationships. But actually, hospitality is a bit hard to define. Because first and foremost, I think hospitality is a heart posture, isn't it? Jesus was hospitable and he didn't have a home. And so it's a posture of heart. But then when our heart is postured towards hospitality, it leaks out into our lives, into our budget, into our time, into our actions. You see, hospitality is about providing a space for God's Spirit to move. Setting a table, cooking a meal, doing the dishes is a ministry of facilitation. Providing a context in which people feel loved and welcomed, where God's Spirit can be at work in their lives. It's central to life in the kingdom. It's central to the kingdom of God. Eating and drinking with others who are both near and far from Jesus. And it sounds super simplistic, doesn't it? Because it is. It's really simple. And it's something that in many ways has ceased to be the hallmark of the church. Henry Nouwen says, if there was ever any concept worth restoring to its original depths and evocative potential, it's the concept of hospitality. So what hospitality is not? Many of us hear the word hospitality and we think entertainment. Setting the perfect table, cooking an oppressive 3-course meal, making sure the house is spotless and the kids are well behaved. But biblically, hospitality is something very different. You see, entertainment is about impressing. Hospitality is about including. It's not about cooking the perfect meal. You don't have to be a cordon bleu chef to be hospitable. It's not about presenting yourself or your household as this perfect picture of homely bliss. The goal of hospitality is not about impressing others. It's about including others. Entertainment is about performance. Hospitality is about presence, being amongst people, being with people. Entertainment is about showing off. Hospitality is about showing up. Entertainment, there's a clear line between a host and a guest. Hospitality blurs that line. It's what I love about the story of Jesus when he eats with people. Wherever he went, Jesus was both a host and a guest. And he always came with both what he could give and what could be received. Entertainment is an act of reciprocity. And I'll have you over and it'll be your turn next time. I'll pay for lunch this time. You pay next time. That's fine, but hospitality is an act of generosity. You give and expect nothing in return because you give of yourself as a gift. Hospitality is not limited to married people, the well-off, those with large homes. In fact, Rosaria Butterfield, in her book, that another one of our recommended readings, which is The Gospel Comes with House Keys. I love that. But she says this: the most hospitable Christians are often those with great love and meager means. You see, hospitality isn't a gift reserved for some, but it's a command given to all. Paul, as he writes to the church in Rome, in Romans 12, he says, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. The word practice there in the Greek is defined as to do something with intense effort or with a definitive purpose or goal. It could be translated as be eager to practice hospitality. Likewise, Peter in 1 Peter 4:9, he says, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. And so as we think about hospitality, it's more than just feeding people. It's more than simply entertaining. Renew, and again, he says this: hospitality can at first bring to mind soft, sweet kindness, tea parties, bland conversations, and a general atmosphere of coziness. But hospitality is not a dynamic, sentimental affair, a watered-down piety. When honored and exercised as a divine imperative, it is about knowing that reaching out to others is an act of worship. Thus, it's challenging, humbling, and spiritually transformative. In many ways, the goal of hospitality is about creating an environment, a place of encounter, of welcome, of warmth. Christine Pohl, in her book, Making Room, writes about 10 markers that make a home a place of hospitality. Number 1, she says it's comfortable. Number 2, it's a home that's lived in. Number 3, it's a place where people can flourish. Number 4, it's not necessarily beautifully decorated, but it's a home that is well cared for. Number 5, it's a place of safety and sanctity where people can retreat from the anxiety of the world. Number 6, it's not frantic or stressful, but a place where you will walk in and feel a slower pace and a sense of peace. Number 7, it's a place where life is celebrated, where the discipline of celebration has become a habit of the heart. Number 8, it's a place where pain and disappointment and sadness of life is welcome. Number 9, it's a place where the detail points to the simple beauty of life, where attention to a detail expresses an appreciation for life, which is more to do with taking time than having money. Finally, it's marked by tradition, where guests are invited into, but not forced into. These traditions can include, praying before a meal, reading a Bible, practicing Sabbath. As people spend time in our homes, they should find that they slow down and experience soulful healing rhythms of the way of Jesus. Sounds like a pretty cool house to go to. So why does hospitality matter? Why is this important? Well, think about our cultural moment. We live in one of the most loneliest times in human history. People can have hundreds, if not thousands, of connections online, but very few friends they can call at 2 a.m. when life is in crisis. And in a cultural environment like that, hospitality is radical. It says to people, you belong. You're welcome at my table. You're seen, you're known, you're worth something, you're loved. Meals were boundary markers in the first century. Who you ate with said everything about who you accepted. And that's why people were so scandalized when Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. But Jesus redefines a meal as God's welcome. Around a table, people experience grace and belonging and transformation. And I believe we're called to do the same. We're called to do the same. It's where our church started. 3 years ago, when we started gathering people in our home, we gathered people around the largest table we could buy. And we ate together. And we learned to do life together. And we learned to share in one another's lives and appreciate one another. That's the genesis of our church family. And actually, on the last Sunday of each month, like 10 times a year, we've tried to keep this tradition going with a table Sunday. And I just want to say, and I just think this is important to say, a table Sunday, which happens 10 times a year, okay, is just as formational, just as life-giving as anything, quote, we've done this morning. It's just as important. A while back, I heard a story of someone who had drifted from church and faith. And what drew them back wasn't some sort of flashy event. It was a simple invitation from a neighbor to come over to dinner. And that meal turned into another meal, which turned into a conversation about life and faith and God and Jesus. And eventually that person said, if this is what faith looks like, people opening their lives to one another, then I'm in. Then I'm in. Sometimes revival doesn't start in a stadium with lots of excitement where we sing, praise the Lord. Sometimes revival starts with the lasagna at a kitchen table. So how do we do this? How do we become a people of hospitality? As I said, hospitality is not about having the perfect home, but it's a posture of heart. If you're a family in our church, it might look like squeezing one more chair around your already crazy dinner table. If you're a single person, it could be making space for friends to sit with you over coffee or a takeaway. If you're in a city group, it might be taking a week to eat together and extending that welcome to others outside of the group. What matters isn't the menu, but the welcome. And so just like last week, we had a challenge to engage with the scriptures. This week, we have a challenge to engage with hospitality. And so over this next month, we want you to aim to eat two meals, or at least share a coffee or a dessert with others this month. And each of those, one of them, we'd encourage you to do that with someone in church, okay? So it might be a friend in church that you have a meal with. And then the other challenge is to have a meal or coffee or a dessert or whatever you want to have with a non-Christian friend, a neighbor, or a co-worker. Okay, that's the challenge. That's the small step, the small invite to be hospitable, to practice hospitality. As I said, hospitality is not entertainment. It's the gospel made visible. So let's open our doors. Let's pull out the emergency chairs and let's invite people to our table, just as Jesus did and invited us to do likewise. That we want to be a place of hospitality, a people of hospitality. I think as Paul said last week, we're not doing this kind of this series to set everyone up to fail, which is often the way we feel when we do these kinds of series, isn't it? It's like, oh, I failed. But the invitation is just to take some small steps, to take that next step. We're not saying, invite 20 people round and cook a meal. We're just saying have dinner with one person, one other person. Buy another person a coffee. Whatever it might take. What does it look like for you to take that small step towards being a people of hospitality? So if you're able to, why don't we stand and I'll quickly pray.